Hi, welcome to More Christ. Today I'm joined by Alex Kaschuta. Alex is a writer, a cultural critic, a podcast host from Romania. Her writing has been featured at the New York Post, the American Mind, Vice, and other outlets. She's the host now of the fantastic Subversive Podcast. So just to begin then, Alex, I want to ask you what moved you first to start the podcast?
I think I had the opportunity to speak to people who were very interesting to me because I got a little bit of notoriety on Twitter, and I also had a lot of mutuals, or that's Twitter speak for people who follow you and you follow them, who were extremely interesting people. A lot of them anonymous as well. And I thought, okay, this is the format that they present themselves in, but I think they might be fascinating conversationalists as well. And I think I was right because a lot of them turned out to be. So that was kind of the initial purpose of my podcast. Since then, I've had some more, not necessarily mainstream, but people who appear with their face in the world, who exist in that sphere as well. So it's kind of a mix of both anonymous people and people who have a public profile and something interesting to say, especially about what is now probably called the post-liberal moment. There's many conversations going on about this whole concept of post-liberalism. A lot of people see faults in liberalism. Some people think that they are at the root. There's a rot that starts from the bottom of the system. So there needs to be a lot of conversations about what comes next, and I'm trying to explore that space as well.
Excellent. And then I want to ask you a bit about that term subversive. So I think in contrast to a lot of the kind of online pandering and pseudo activism, there is something genuinely subversive about your podcast. And I want to ask you about that title and why subversive and why now in this way, I suppose.
Yeah, I think the name subversive, the kind of the attribute subversive was attributed to kind of communist infiltrators back in the day, and it's associated with all sorts of other kind of subgroups that infiltrate and disturb an existing order. That's not the case in here. Essentially, the people that I speak to are the subversives of today. They are infiltrated. A lot of them are anonymous. They kind of exist in parallel to normal society, and they have to hide and they have to be subversive to subvert things from the inside, because the standing regime will not protect them if they are open with their ideas. So essentially, that was the idea behind subversive. At the same time, it's the market's saturated with all sorts of names, and I thought this was a decently free space around this word, and that's also a big consideration in choosing it.
Marvelous. Thanks, Alex. And I want to ask you then about your own kind of personal journey, as it were, and what broke the spell regarding your kind of maybe faith in the myths of liberalism in its kind of broad philosophical and anthropological sense, even aside from that kind of specific political sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, I think it does make sense. What red pilled me, what radicalized me. Um, there's this is probably a pipeline that's quite established at this point. I stumbled upon the works of one Curtis Yarvin, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, tied into the works of Nick Land, which is kind of a British philosopher who kind of explores the same space. He refers to Curtis Yarvin quite a lot as well. So those were kind of the first works that let me know that there might be something interesting in this space. I wasn't sold actually for the first time I read these things because they're quite brutal. They're quite harsh for someone who's grown up in immersed in liberalism. It is the water we swim in. It's very hard to see it from the outside. But what it did was kind of nudge me from my position at the center of my liberal existence to being able to kind of see it from the outside in a little bit, and maybe not see it as the end of history as I've been taught, but as a regime that has its own faults and has its own life cycle, and also look at it from kind of a game theoretical perspective, like, okay, what happens next? We have this chessboard set up this way, and it's been set up this way maybe 100, 200 years ago, which is I think the main difference between kind of post-liberal thinking and what, for example, the IDW would say, which is kind of the main anti-woke core of people talking about, okay, these wokies have gone crazy. They would say, oh, okay, things went badly, I don't know, in the 60s because they're, I don't know, French postmodernist infiltration into the universities or some more recent problem. What post-liberalism essentially does is it sees it sees the premises of liberalism being kind of the game theoretical, space where what wokeness and whatever comes after wokeness is almost essentially bound to happen. It's part of the flow of how something like this works, because there are no core principles in liberalism. It's the idea that we can have pluralism, everyone can come to the table with their own value sets, and the system itself is valueless. It just harbors these different groups of people. The reality is that the system has values. I mean, wokeness is the spirit of the system. It is the metaphysics of liberalism at the moment. So the idea that these values don't exist, no, they will just be seen as common sense, because that's what a lot of people, especially people who strive to have status in the current regime, they see, children transitioning or things like that. That's, it wasn't common sense 5 years ago, but this permanent revolution is common sense. Not being with it, with the current ideas, of the mainstream, means that you're retrograde, and you lack common sense. You're someone who's antiquated. So yeah, I think that was the radicalizing moment for me. And obviously there's so many conversations flowing into this. What I said, my gateway was this space it's commonly referred to as neo-reaction, but some other spaces have, I've had people on my podcast who are radicalized by more, moderate people, like, for example, reading The Decadent Society by Ross Douthat, which is a very, moderate type book. So yeah, more and more people are kind of coming to similar conclusions from different directions. And it's, it's an interesting space to be in. It's exciting intellectually. It's also really scary. It's very scary to have to reassess the foundations of the world we live in, a prosperous world, a wonderful world in many ways, with a lot of advances. And, our ancestors did tend to live sometimes more brutal lives, more problematic lives in many ways. But I think the problem is that we don't really have a choice, because in a way, post-liberalism also is, okay, liberalism is in decline. It's also realizing that liberalism is in decline, and even if we like some aspects of liberalism, how do we protect these from the forces that are tearing liberalism apart from the inside? So yeah, it's wonderful, exhilarating, and also scary.
Yeah, man. And I want to ask you something that I find particularly interesting is your kind of awakening to the limitations of the kind of new atheist movement, which sort of came across in your talks with people like Paul Kingsnorth, whom I love, and Sarab Amari, people like that. And it seems that you were once quite devoted to that movement, as it were. And what sparked that, and how has that progressed?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I think Jordan Peterson had quite a lot to do with that. If you were connected to those conversations when, for example, Jordan Peterson had discussions with Sam Harris, and he used to be one of the high priests of new atheism. And I was really unsatisfied with how he performed in those debates. Like, I felt that Peterson brought an entire extremely relevant space to the conversation, and Sam Harris was completely dismissing even the existence of that space. And that to me was quite, shifted me quite a lot. And I think from that point on, I became a bit not necessarily suspicious, but much more open to absorbing learnings from this alternative space that was presented by Jordan Peterson. So to me, that was a really significant moment. Since then, I've kind of learned more about religion. It's a tough one, because I was kind of marinating in new atheism for a very long time. I mean, I think I was in my early teens, maybe 13 or 14 when I read The God Delusion, and I was so struck by it that I bought multiple copies, which were very hard to get in Romania. They were only in English, and I gave them to every person I knew that spoke English well enough to read it. It was kind of the zealotry of the converted, and I was very, very into it. And I also kind of I was really into debating people. I ruined many a party by being, that person trying to, debate like deeply religious. I don't know. I had like a friend who was like, I think Baptist, and he was very religious. And, it took me months to break him down. And it's absolutely, I mean, looking back, I was, the energies of youth. I definitely wouldn't do that now, but yeah, that was kind of the intellectual thing that you would do if you were that type of curious person, and it was trending upwards. It was high status, and then slowly, like I said, it took someone like Jordan Peterson to provide an obviously good and obviously relevant alternative space that exists at least at the same status level as the one that New Atheism provided, and to say, okay, there's the idea of that there's a whole other conception of truth outside of the rational perspective, where you're like, okay, I'm a rational animal, I'm empirically observing the universe, and I'm reacting in this space. There are many things that you can't observe. There are many things that you can't even conceptualize, and that can't even flow into your decision making. So what do you do about that space? How do you interact with that? And then for that space, you have traditions, norms, things that maybe evolved as well, but they evolved under different types of pressures rather than what science tells us is the direct line. So that was, for me, that was kind of an important milestone.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing, Alex. And I want to ask you next, if I may, about an historian that I'm particularly drawn to, who had a kind of seminal role in my own political conversion, as it were, moving away from kind of liberal and kind of extreme left-wing shibboleths in some instances. So Christopher Lash, I want to ask, what is so insightful about him and his critiques of the kind of dominant culture of narcissism, and how have you tried to go beyond this kind of self-obsession in your own life then? How's maybe even having a family impacted you in that respect?
Yes, absolutely. I think the wondrous thing about Christopher Lash and his works is that they were extremely, people say prescient, but it also explains that whatever we're experiencing now was very much present in, what was it, like the 70s and 80s, 90s as well, that he wrote in. And it was already kind of, it reached its final form at that point. That's one interesting bit about Lash. So he already kind of sensed the outline of the beast, and he was describing it in exact detail at that point. And has my culture of narcissism changed since I have become a mother? Yes, indeed it has, and it also kind of allowed me to realize how much narcissism I was involved in, and it really it puts you outside of yourself in a way. You're not at the center of your own life anymore in a way. So for example, I'm not as concerned about how I'm perceived by other people as I used to be. Just my order of priorities has changed. And the most important thing to me now is completely outside of myself. I'm, in a way, a mere protection mechanism for this other person, and it's good that way, and it's wonderful, and it's also a relief. I feel like a lot of people don't realize how much pressure narcissism is, how hard it is to strive to fulfill this image that you have of yourself, or that you want others to have of you. It's just a continual treading of water, a continual climb to a place that never comes. It's exhausting, and I think it's tied into also the epidemic of anxiety and depression that people are experiencing. The idea that you constantly have to live up to your authenticity. You have to discover yourself. You have to self-improve. You have to grind. You have to hustle. You have to have a side gig. You have to become someone in the complex tapestry of unique beings that we all are. So it's exhausting to just try to participate in society in the way that you're expected to. So having a child really kind of kicks you out of that mode, because not only is there someone who's more important, there are many activities to do. It's not just permanent relaxation. Their life becomes much harder. It becomes more physical. I have a very heavy child. I have to lug him around all day. I'm already just from through that activity is I'm more embodied by having to do that. And to play, to invent things, to sing to him. You're constantly connected to something that's outside of you, which is completely fascinating and wonderful and important. And in a way, you're kind of engaged in an act of worship, because you're just biologically tied to this beautiful being. And it's a continuous process. You can't really say, oh, I'm tired today. I'm just gonna, call it a day and I'm gonna head to bed, call in sick to being a mom. It doesn't really work, especially if you don't have much help around.
Yeah.
No, you're gonna have to continue being this, and in a way, you want to do it because it's your child. I think it's a really wonderful process. Also, not to completely say that it's all upside. Obviously, it is hard. My life is much harder than it used to be in practical terms, but it's also much more meaningful and wonderful. So, yeah, I'd recommend it. 10 out of 10 would do again.
Brilliant. And I want to ask you then, in light of that experience now, sort of looking back, how does that maybe contrast with the image that you had maybe growing up and this kind of impact of new waves of feminism? Because I've seen you have been more favorable now recently towards people like Mary Harrington, who I think is fantastic, and a more nuanced understanding of feminism. And I wonder how that kind of marries or contrasts then.
Yeah, well, growing up, I didn't want to have anything to do with the classical domain of womanhood. I was very much, and I was the quintessence of the neoliberal individual. I just wanted to go off to college and never come back, and I don't know, go to work and make a lot of money. And it was very fuzzy exactly what I wanted to do, but I wanted to have experiences, travel the world, exactly what people tell you that success looks like. Independent of your gender, you should be accumulating experiences and and finding yourself, your authenticity. So I wasn't the kind of girl who dreamt about getting married, about dresses, about children, especially because I also kind of grew up in I was very isolated from other children and also from babies. So to be honest, I probably held one or two babies before I held my own baby. So zero experience. I had to YouTube quite a lot to understand what exactly to do. I remember even when I was in the hospital with my baby, like there was a nurses helping me to change his diaper, and she was looking at me. So come on, do it. I was like, I've never done one of these, so you have to do it, and I'll try it afterwards. They were very shocked that I had never changed that. Well, that's just me being, the quintessential neoliberal individual. I don't change diapers. I have no idea how to. So so there was no actual connection to this world of the eternal feminine for me. I also did not want to get married. My family situation was kind of very, very turbulent. There's always fights, kind of in the end, it turned into divorce. And it was just, I just couldn't imagine getting into a situation like that. And I didn't see the upside at all. It just felt to me like, okay, you marry someone and then it's a perpetual war until the day you divorce, and then maybe then you have a day of silence. And I was like, why go through it in the first place? So essentially what turned it around for me was I think partly a feeling of physiological call for it at one point. I think I was kind of in my mid to later 20s when there's just something in me that I was like, okay, I think I get it. I think there's something here. Children seem pretty interesting to me right now. So I kind of started thinking about this sphere and exploring it. And then also my new atheism softened as well. I was just more interested in kind of a spiritual dimension. I also saw kind of that my pursuits really didn't go anywhere. Like whenever I conquered a new mountain, I was looking down into the abyss, and with every new mountain, the abyss got wider and wider and wider, and there's literally nothing that could, in a way, satisfy me. I just kind of, was on this hedonic treadmill, and I just felt like I had to run faster and faster to get absolutely nowhere. And the idea that, I'm just going to get another promotion or, make more money, like to do what, to not have more time to spend it, or, it just all seemed a bit empty. So then I realized, okay, maybe it's time to change course. And then around my mid-20s, I decided, okay, I will, I'm going to do my darndest to find someone to share my life with and to have children and to have a more traditional life, or I mean, now, we're using traditional, just like normal, like, what people have always done. Try to return to my roots as a human being. You don't even have to label it, because now I'm associated with this whole label of being trad. I'm just a woman who's married and has kids, or, has kid. So it's not, it just feels so weird. Everything has to be a fetish nowadays. You can't, you can't just be normal. Everything's, it's part of your authenticity. I identify as a traditionalist.
Mhm.
It's a strange space to be in. So yeah, I think, I don't know necessarily how much of this was ideological or me having some sort of epiphany, how much of it was biological, was, just, me hearing the call of nature yeah, exactly, do what I'm supposed to be doing. How much was me just getting over the promises that were made to me by society and realizing, okay, yeah, this is empty. I'll never know, but I'm very happy where I am now. I'm happy I, made this decision in my mid-20s. It takes a while, even when you're looking for someone to get married to get married, to decide to have children. There's a bit of a lag time there. So I managed to do it in time. And I know that, a lot of women don't really or think about this stuff when they're in like their mid 30s. It's hard. It really is hard, because there's also this layer of, a lot of men think you're desperate in your mid 30s, so they're kind of already avoiding the situation of, you don't want to get with a woman and then she has baby fever within 3 months. And yeah, I mean, I also understand that perspective, but yeah, so it's good to, if you have this in mind, maybe do it sooner rather than later, because yeah, there's some lag time involved.
I'm into that. And I want to ask you, kind of in line with that a little bit, then another figure that we both seem to appreciate is Roger Scruton. So, in line with his work, then I want to ask, what's the importance of place or home for the subversive today? Again, we don't need to focus too much on labels. It's kind of local or even national, in contrast to the kind of rootless cosmopolitan mindset of the kind of elites and their legacy of like bland coffee chains and all that kind of nonsense. That makes sense.
Yes, place is very important. It's it's one of those variables that has been suppressed by elite thinking, just because it's exclusionary by definition. You can't be, for example, Irish in the sense that you are Irish. You speak the language. You are immersed in the place, the culture. You have family in the region. Not everyone can be Irish. Like someone coming from Ghana today is not going to be Irish, and that is anathema to the liberal mind. You cannot fathom that there are categories that are precious and useful, and that people do well to appreciate and cherish and want to continue, that are exclusionary, that you cannot access. Like even I can't become Irish overnight. Maybe in a generation or so, if I really, and with the idea that I integrate myself into the rituals and the practices and the families and the language, maybe. But the idea that, if one of us is Irish, we are all Irish. No, we're not, and it's fine. It's good that we have, we have French people that are different from the Irish, and they have their own, specific cultures, which extend past the cuisine. It's not all about just some kind of this obsession of people that think, multiculturalism is having many restaurants. Yes, maybe. But then you end up having like a whole section of London that is just Turkish restaurants. Is that multicultural? I don't know. It's an enclave. So yeah, it's understandable that people bristle at the idea that these categories are important, but I think they reflect something very. It's not just genetics, but it's something that is precious to each human being, and without it, you see people going a little bit off the rails. With, for example, this whole obsession with how you identify. If people are obsessed with how they identify because they don't identify as the things that they should be identifying. They don't identify with their family. They don't identify with languages and cultures and things like that. Those things have been deracinated completely. They've been almost raised off the face of the earth, and you should be ashamed if you associate with these things. So we need to invent all of these other categories. Some, like, for example, even being fat is now something that you can identify with, or that can be part of your identity. But that's essentially kind of an externality of a market that's producing this dysfunction of society, where so many people are just extremely fat because they have these irresistible, hyper palatable foods available everywhere. And then the solution that we have in society is that, okay, we're just going to turn this into a protected category. The solution to the problem that everyone's fat is that you shouldn't call them fat. You call them a person of size or something like that. So it's it's a bit ridiculous. And we've done this with many other things. Like, for example, I don't know, sexual promiscuity as well. You shouldn't slut shame, and then people either identify as sluts, or you don't call them sluts because that's really bad, but they identify as sex positive or something like that. So there's all these newfangled attributes to slap onto social dysfunctions because these women aren't happy. The idea that you're now being essentially used by X amount of men just because you do it consensually. I mean, you do it consensually after a while, but then your soul dies, and then maybe you revisit that consensual relationship. So it's a strange place that we find ourselves in, where your natural identities are anathema, and now you have to pick from this menu of toxic sludge that you have to identify with just to fill that hole where your identity is supposed to be, because we tend to want to be someone to other people, because that's all identity is. Like, who am I to you? Who are you to me? How do you relate to me? Where is my place in the social hierarchy? How do I relate to other people? And it's really important. But yeah, it's not a very healthy way to do it. I mean, the way we're told that this is your authenticity. You can just assemble a menu of labels, and then that's your unique snowflake self. Because these are all empty, and like I said, they're essentially trying to shoehorn positivity into things that are practically toxic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that, Alex. And another kind of part of that traditional embodied living is a healthy relationship with the environment, or Christians would say the creation, which I want to ask you about. What does a sort of conservative green philosophy maybe look like, in contrast to that kind of to treat everything as stuff, or maybe the other flip side, the ardent environmentalism, which seeks to impose top-down kind of regulations from NGOs or states and things like that?
Yeah, I think there is a natural conservation in conservatism, or in kind of the right, which ties also into the idea of localism and stewardship of territory of where you live, and it's also attributing rights to these spaces, and not only through this legalistic frame, because essentially what the left wing does is says, okay, we need new laws, we need the government to mediate our relationship with the environment, they need to tax, outlaw, do things. That's not the ideal relationship that you can have with your environment, because the government is a very blunt tool. It doesn't really work. What essentially ends up happening is you have these inflated, apparatchiks, and just there's not actually, the budget that you have there is not going to things that actually work. So the solution that the right wing has, or should have, if it wasn't so obsessed with being kind of this kind of the libertarian free market fusionist type ideas that, you know, Reaganomics type right wing, which is slowly isn't anymore, but there's still kind of a big core of that. Is that to go back to this model of local stewardship, to empower people who, you know, within the local hierarchy to protect these spaces, and not do it necessarily through, you know, the blunt force of centralized government, but to have, you know, local committees that are in charge of X parcel of land, and to have strict limits on, you know, like urbanism and things like that, to decide, okay, you know, what is under the hand of the commercial, because at the moment everything is almost under the hand of what's commercially possible, and what is off limits, and what is, you know, the patrimony of people in this region. So I think that's a big difference between right wing and left wing approaches to the environment.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Alex. So next, if we may, I'd love to look at some of your writings and use those as a little kind of springboard to talk about a few ideas that seem to have developed over time. So one being The Behemoth, Welcome to Your New Religion. So I want to ask you, even going from 2020 to today in some of your writings. And first thing would be tolerance, kind of liberal doctrine you criticized even in 2020. And I want to ask why you find that so insufferable. And can you describe that a little bit, and how the work on your podcast has only reaffirmed or added to that kind of skepticism for the kind of sloganeering, as it were, over actually real life that we're kind of hinting at?
Yeah, because I think, you know, what I was saying before as well, related to, you know, the idea that liberalism is empty of values. It has one core value: the idea that, you know, you don't want to repeat the Second World War. You don't want to, you know, reestablish that dynamic between pure evil and persecution, like the ultimate persecuted minority, and that kind of enshrines tolerance at the core of liberalism. Okay, we do anything for tolerance, whichever way that is interpreted today. So, for example, you know, today obviously Ukraine is a narrative that kind of has to fold into the concept of tolerance, and who do we tolerate and who don't we tolerate, and you need to exert extreme grace to the victims and extreme prejudice to the people who are seen as being the oppressors. So that's kind of, you see all these narratives folding into, you know, the anti-vaxxers, also extreme prejudice against the anti-vaxxers. So whichever world event is happening right now, and there has to be one core world event in the middle of the narrative nowadays to motivate this polarity, to say, okay, who are the Nazis, who are the Jews? We always need to know, who are these people, and how does that play out? So that essentially is, I think that's kind of what I wrote about in 2020. So sometimes it's hard to remember exactly what I wrote about, but it's you know, the idea that you know, this is the core ideal at the heart of liberalism, and it plays out in many strange ways, and that we have to identify it as such, and to realize that, you know, tolerance might be a value, as such as, you know, like racism might be a vice, it might be a sin for sure. Is it the only value that we want to optimize for? Is racism the only sin we need to? Because essentially racism is the opposite of tolerance. It's just the extreme prejudice. That's what we're trying to get rid of in our society. I mean, yes, important values, sure. The only values, no, I don't think so. Might there be situations in which other values supersede, you know, being perceived as racist or intolerant? Yes, I think so. And I think that, you know, we're doing a lot of stupid things by being very afraid of being tarred with these sins, and not being able to actually, you know, orient ourselves along other more productive axes. So I think that's I think what I meant in that article, maybe.
No, that's great. Thank you, Alex. And recently I spoke with Dr. Erica Bakioki, who's much to say about feminism that we hinted at from a good or ill from a Catholic perspective. And then another feminist of a different sort, we might say, is Mary Harrington, who we mentioned. Just regarding that, I want to ask you a little bit more about what appeals to about, say, Mary Harrington's concept of reactionary feminism, and then what are some of the ways that contrasts, say, with modern feminism or much of the modern kind of trans ideology?
Yes, I really love Mary Harrington's work. I feel like she's going places. I think she's going to be one of the intellectual superstars of today and tomorrow. What appeals to me about reactionary feminism? It's an interesting concept because if you ask someone who's not necessarily as versed in the theory of feminism as Mary, they would say that reactionary feminism is not feminism at all. It is feminism in the sense that it is there to protect the interests of women. But it's also it is reactionary in the sense that it completely rejects the positions that classical or third wave feminism posits as to be in the interests of women. So what it rejects is this conception that women are individuals, are only individuals, and that they are striving to be, to essentially kind of acquire that authenticity. They're acting only from that perspective. I mean, what reactionary feminism brings in is the perspective as women, as for example, part of kind of the symbiosis with children, as women, part of family. So women that have interests that are uniquely tied to these institutions and to these other people, and that are not completely deracinated so what reactionary feminism optimizes for is for women in that entangled mode as part of a greater whole rather than women as individuals, which you see kind of this girl boss feminism say, okay, you can make more money, you're in a constant adversarial relationship to men, you need to get more out of your relationship with men, if your husband doesn't do this X and Y, divorce him, things like that. So yes, so in a way these two perspectives have almost nothing in common. And it is strange to call them both feminism, but they are. The only thing that unites them is the idea that, okay, they're both working in the interests of women. Mary says these are not the interests of women.
Mm-hmm.
So she has a completely different perspective on what the interests of women are. And you were asking about trans. Well, trans is just the next step in women are individuals, people are individuals. There's some homunculus behind the eyes piloting this meat suit, deciding that today I want to be a woman. Today I want to be, I don't know, whatever type of cisgendered. there's all sorts of new neologisms. Cisgender just means normal, but there's all sorts of asexual, bisexual, plurisexual, pansexual types of attributes that you can identify as, pronouns that you can identify as, which are just kind of like in video games, they're skins, they're little bits of identity that you can essentially pay for if you consider surgery and hormones and things like that you can add to your spectrum of qualities and that you've chosen as a rational individual. I mean, reactionary feminism kind of rejects the idea that you are the rational individual or that is your primary mode. So in a way, that's how it also rejects the idea of trans. Trans is impossible if you take reactionary feminism at its word, that this is not the primary mode of being, especially for women. So yeah, that's kind of what I understand it as. I think it's a useful and interesting concept, especially because it's kind of it's confusing, but also kind of softens people up because it's like, oh, it's feminism, but how is it different? It makes people ask this, and then they find out, and then they're like, oh, so it's not like feminism at all. So yeah, it's useful.
That's excellent. Thank you, Alex. And alongside the kind of philosophical trickle down of ideas that I think does a lot of damage to society oftentimes, obviously it's good in the right instances, but in what we're hinting at, there's also the kind of changes in technology and that how that has a kind of acts as a catalyst for some of these bad ideas and it intertwines with those. So you've written about this. So alongside that, discussing these kind of ideas and trends, you point helpfully, I think, to the role of, say, the internet and modern technologies, focusing on how they make us more and less free, kind of ambiguous. So in one article you wrote, plastic, rigid and polarized, it seems that you've developed your thoughts since. Can you tell us a bit about that and why it's important that we wrestle with and reflect on the impact of technology in order to live well today then?
Yes, I think technology is underrated by a lot of people who like to think philosophically. A lot of people who are interested in philosophy and history tend to think that the theory comes before the practical implementation of said theory. Like, for example, even a lot of critics of feminism say, oh, feminism came in, and then women realized based on this philosophy that they could be free, and then they appeal to the men to give them rights, and that's kind of how things snowballed from that point. I think a lot of times it's the other way around. You have events in history, events in technology, events that, for example, made us prosperous, made the problem of food and shelter less of a complex thing to be solved daily, and it also allowed men and women to drift apart. Like, for example, systems like patriarchy were not negotiable back in the day. If people would opt out of these systems, it would mean essentially chaos for a larger group of people. It was just not possible to say, oh, I'm just going to go off backpacking through Europe in the 1400s. It doesn't work like that. Everyone depends on you to be providing X amount of labor for for the food. There's property concerns to be solved by marriage. There's all sorts of very practical things that have to be solved by these relationships between people. When technology came in to create labor-saving devices, to create an abundance of food, to, when you could work an hour to get a day's worth of food, which is, unheard of historically, then, all of this theory became possible. All of these rights became, human rights. And this really couldn't have happened. And now we were at the point where technology really has reached a point where it really is just playing with kind of ancestral parts of our minds in a way that is really in a way of modern slavery, where you really cannot disentangle yourself from these machines. And a lot of these addicting technologies are extremely legal. Like, for example, social media uses the same technology as slot machines. Slot machines are slightly regulated in some regions, but everyone knows that this is addicting technology. It destroys families. It's about as addicting as alcoholism. There's all sorts of little things like this. Even, we were talking about food earlier. Food has the same properties now. People have figured out what is hyper palatable food, what exact proportion between salt, sweetness, softness, chewiness is most adapted to what people like to eat. That food, not coincidentally, makes you sick and fat, and then they're serving this everywhere. And I can also understand the kind of the libertarian argument that you don't want the state intervening in everything, but at the same time, there's this stuff is like I said, it is a form of modern slavery, and a lot of people are very susceptible to this. If you go to a low-income neighborhood all around the world, what are you going to see? You're going to see gambling establishments. You're going to see slot machine salons. You're going to see all sorts of these kind of dens of enslavement, and they're preying on the weak. Bars and things like that. Obviously, this stuff is not necessarily new, but we've just found another 1,000 ways to do what alcohol has been doing forever. So it's a scary thing. I don't necessarily know how you could opt out of it outside of some form of Amish thing. Is the only solution to have the government intervene in every one of these industries and disrupt it? I don't see that as a positive either. I don't think the government is a very good tool to sort this out. So it's a complex problem, and I think we're going to have to face it eventually, because you see this, like all of these tools are messing people up. They're messing teenagers up. They're, these are very dangerous things, and I don't think we've reckoned with how much we've changed in how humans exist and relate to each other in the last 10 years. It's been about 10 years since the first iPhone. It feels like forever. It really feels like, have we ever lived another way? We are kind of a different type of creature at this point. So I feel like a huge reckoning is coming, and yeah, there's going to be a way to deal with this. I don't know exactly which way it's going to go.
Excellent. Thanks, Alex. I think alongside the recent actions with geopolitics, that also what you're saying undermines this kind of liberal conception that human beings are primarily rational, kind of just simple choosing creatures, and shows the impact of these different kind of facets of reality all taking place at once. So my next sort of question is in line with that. So I really enjoyed your conversation with Sohrab Ahmari, and I kind of broadly agree with him, obviously from a Christian perspective, that restoring the Sabbath and a kind of Sabbath consciousness would be a real help, and even principles alongside utilitarian kind of help, and a great good alongside the kind of leisure that Joseph Pieper, the philosopher, talks about, and so on. And I think this is an area that speaks to what you're really unveiling there, not just that we're kind of religious in a propositional sense, but that we kind of conduct these liturgies to order our societies and our lives. And this is something you see in the Canadian philosopher James K. Smith and the Orthodox theologian Father Schmemann. They've written about these kind of secular liturgies versus Christian liturgies, something that I think sort of became obvious with COVID and say the BLM protests. Jonathan Pajot, a YouTuber I really like, he described the kind of role of sacrifice and how these liturgies play out, which is fascinating. So I just want, in kind of in line with all of that, then I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts on one that and any kind of subversive habits, rituals, things like that that you've been developing maybe to subvert those new kind of liturgies that we're talking about? If that makes sense.
Yes, I think people do have to impose all sorts of methods of self constraint, if you can, because kind of my other point on this type of this perspective that everyone is a rational agent is that everyone is a rational agent on a spectrum. There are people who are very irrational, who are much more prone to be victimized by this, who, I'm sorry to say, might benefit from a sort of paternalism in some respects, which has completely been gutted now. We don't have any more guardrails. Far be it from us to say what you should do with your life, even if you're someone who's completely disoriented.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who have always benefited from the choose your own adventure menu, people who are high in conscientiousness, who are high in intelligence, high in all sorts of qualities that give you status if you're in that space. It's much easier for them to say, oh, of course people are rational animals, because in a way, yes, you are probably more rational than others, and it's beneficial for you. And if in a system like this, if someone else fails, oh, they must have just chosen wrong. I chose well. I'm a product of meritocracy. I've done the best choosing. I chose to go to Stanford. Good. That's amazing. So it also kind of legitimates the hierarchy that we have now. The idea that you're here, as a product of your own choices. And in a way, that's something that I just had an anonymous poster on my show yesterday night. It's going to come out a bit later. Kofefe Anon, and he has this whole thing where he says the wokes are more right than the mainstream, and kind of woke people or people who are in the space, they realize that. This is true, that the meritocracy that is being promoted by kind of the core establishment is a sham, and that a lot of people are falling through the cracks, and that the people at the top didn't get there pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, but their explanation is that it's racism, it's oppression, something's keeping these people down. Mm-hmm. Well, in reality, a lot of people just don't have the capacity to get to these points, and does everybody get to go to Stanford? No, they don't. That's the realistic answer to this. Will there always be inequality? Yes, there will. But do we live in a meritocracy? In a way, yes, but also, these people are left behind and they're being abused by a system that, doesn't see itself or doesn't want to see itself. So, I thought that's a good insight. I think there was another question, wasn't there, in there?
Yeah, so regarding your own kind of personal habits and kind of liturgies, if we want to call them that, and how that has maybe helped you to support the kind of dominant paradigm.
Yes, I mean, how I've changed mostly is that I've tried to, for example, I try to stay away from my phone on the weekends, which is, hard in itself, but that's kind of one of I don't think I could call it liturgy in any way, but that's one thing I tried to do just because, that's the most time I have, and I try to do a lot of kind of physical work if I can, cooking, gardening, cleaning, being away from the screens as much as I can, because I don't know, I maybe this is just me also interpreting my relationship with the machines a little bit, negatively, but I feel like, every hour I spend that's not specifically target to a specific activity on these platforms and on these screens is something that, I feel like it's reducing from my life. It's sucking the life force out of me, and there is such a thing as, there's a point where, even if I do work, it's, the marginal return is negative. It just is, it's too much, and we're just not made to be in contact with machines so much. So I'm thinking, is there any other ritual that I have? I mean, I'm pretty regimented in how I have my day. It's also, when you have a baby, there's a nap schedule. You kind of have to be very, strict about. I wake up at 5 a.m. I do X at that time, then that happens. So I think that's probably the most ritualistic thing that I do. I go to sleep almost at sundown just because that's what has to happen. So yeah, having a very tight schedule is almost like a ritual, I have to say.
Excellent. Thanks, Alex. And then I want to touch a bit more on some of those kind of new faiths, as it were, and tie some threads together in kind of into a narrative that better fits the facts, I think. So I want to ask you not necessarily about, say, science, but about the kind of scientism, its dominant kind of physicalist and strangely neo-Gnostic kind of form. Has this then, as some sort of scholars and I think clearly YouTubers have argued, cleared away the old time religion, as it were, and left a vacuum for the kind of new pseudo religions only to emerge, say, in the form of transhumanism, which I think shares many of the same underlying presuppositions that we mentioned earlier with trans ideology? And what are some of the kind of main problems with that from your perspective now, even?
Yeah, I think that, scientism is a natural religion to emerge, because it's been a provider of actual miracles, things that are inexplicable to a lot of people. Like, how does your microwave work? How does the TV even work? How does this work? How does, inter country internet Zoom calls? How does this work? It's quite miraculous, and the people who do this are quite good at what they do, or else it wouldn't work. So I think a lot of people see this, they know them by their fruits, and then they think that these people are the people to solve societal problems,
Mhm.
because if they can produce, a working product that does something, miraculous, then probably they can produce a working society, and they can produce a working ethical system, and they can, if we just apply the right algorithm to this problem, it will solve, it's just like, having a Zoom call, running a society, having, a moral framework. It's the same. The issue is that it's not the same, because it is very hard to establish what is true in an ethical framework. Because, for example, if you're working in software, you just hit compile, and if it doesn't compile, or if it doesn't actually produce the intended effect, you go back in and you solve it. There's direct feedback on what is true and what is not true, and if the product does what it does, and if it sells in the market, if people actually buy it. There's all sorts of inbuilt feedback mechanisms in this type of activity, and so in science, in some fields, not in social science though, which is why none of them replicate. But in many fields of science, there is direct feedback. So these are kind of a few fields that are very prominent and very interesting and very relevant to modernity, that seem to be the way things work because they're so visible. This is how very few things work, very tiny slither of things that work this way. And politics is not one of those things. Ethics is not one of those things. How we live together, and and what it is to mean, meaning. who am I? What is it to be human? These are things that don't work that way at all. They have no error correction mechanism. There's no direct way. There's no magical way in which truth appears. If you ask these questions, if you put it in the marketplace of ideas, all you're gonna hear is that 1,000 people have 1,000 opinions on what it is to be human. What is meaning? What is life? What is consciousness? Can it even be uploaded? All of these things, they don't work like a computer program. So I think this is a blind spot in our collective vision of what it means to be human. And I also think that, I hope that people are kind of seeing through this, because that's why a lot of people are tired of the IDW, or kind of the core thing where, it's kind of the kind of a parade of the craziest thing woke people have done today. I feel like after 4 years now, we kind of know that the wokies are crazy. Okay, so what? What happens? Why are you different? On what principles do you base your attack on this? On these lifestyles? And usually people don't have any. So now that's kind of people are kind of seeing through the fact that you cannot derive an odd from an is. So. I think that's kind of what I'm in charge of documenting, or at least that's what I've assigned myself to do. I hope people kind of see through this.
Yeah, excellent. I think your work is most important to take people to that next level, as it were, because you see it even with the likes of Bill Maher. I saw one of your former guests, Aaron McIntyre, commented something on Twitter about, yes, he's not changed any of his views. It's really just the culture that's left him behind. It's just a repeat of the old neocon kind of myth, and people kind of stop there. Whereas I think it's great that you're like having punched through that kind of neocon myth and things like that. So I appreciate that. And I wanted to hear your thoughts, actually, Alex, about a bit more about that neo-Gnosticism then, and if you've come across much by Carlo Lanciolotti and Augusto Del Noce, and if you think that their work is important. I think in line with what you're describing there, it is in like I think the neo-Gnostic understanding is very insightful to critique the culture, one thing. And then another thing would be seeing civilization as a kind of social organism united around these kind of embodied communities where we share these collective myths or series of myths, which you'll see in the Noche, Kalikoski, people like that. And I think, again, that undermines at scale the kind of crude rationalism that we were talking about earlier. I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts. I've seen you reference mimesis and different things like that, which I think is more helpful maybe for understanding how these things replicate and pass on, rather than kind of crude rationalism that we're talking about. Do you have anything to say to that point? Or
Yes. I'm not as familiar with Del Noce as I am with Girard, who's kind of the father of the concept of mimesis. I think it's a very useful concept to dispel the myth of the rational individual, because what impels a human to act? It is desire. We would probably just, be hanging out in bed and, being fed through a tube and not be interested in participating in life at all if we didn't have this impetus of going out and doing things, of achieving things. What is the instinct that drives you to drives this quest to achieve X and Y, to get a sports car. What in the world would make someone want a sports car, or I don't know, an inflatable pool to put in your bath, in your backyard or something. It's this instinct of mimesis. You want what other people have. And without being in the space where there are other people to inspire you to want things, or to get into that mimetic rivalry with, and to pursue interest. I mean, this obviously you can go very kind of evo psych on this and say, okay, this is because people are typically in competition for mates. They're in competition to access resources and things like that. Yes, I think that's a probably the source of this type of activity, but at the same time it exists, and it essentially what it tells us is that the idea that you just sit at home and you have this stroke of inspiration as a rational individual to say, okay, I want to be the best lawyer in St. Louis, Missouri than I can be because why? Because my authentic self wants to generate this, and I also want a red sports car. Why do you want a red sports car? Because authentically, it just I feel called to get a red sports car. So it's the idea that these are all self-generated and they're not just part of the way the world influences you and feeds back into you is it kind of dispels this idea that okay, we're just rational agents and we see what we need. I mean, what do you need? You need food and shelter. And maybe a hug, I guess, or something like that. Very, very basic type of stuff that you need. What do you desire? What you desire is infinite. There's an infinity of desires, and it's constantly updating based on, the status hierarchies that you fall into, or the things that you aspire to by seeing other people. So I think that's a really important thing, and that kind of, like you said, it makes it clear that we are all kind of nodes in larger networks, and we are extremely interdependent in everything we do. And if you model your perception of the world as, these, individuals, a whole world of one just deciding what they're going to do, it's just not a functional model of how things actually work. If you know someone, if you know someone's 5 closest friends, you're probably going to be able to predict a very big part of how they are and who they are and what they aspire to. If you just know, I don't know, basic facts about them as an individual, it's going to be a bit harder. So, I think it's it's an interesting way. There are 2 ways to model people. I think there's a lot of value in seeing people as individuals as well. I think that's an innovation of Christianity in a way, but that's just not the only level of aggregation that we have to pay attention to.
Excellent, thank you, Alex. Kind of building on that, I'm wondering then, with the likes of Jordan Peterson, what do you think the remaining insights are that he can offer, and what are some of the limits that you're starting to see now, and where does it kind of come to an end?
Yes, I think Peterson, he opened up the whole concept of the collective unconscious, of archetypes, of religion as a kind of metaphorical truth, of truth as being kind of the pragmatic version of truth, where you have things that prevail or things that survive rather than things that are rationally true in a scientific sense. So I think that's a huge space that he opened up. Is he the ultimate expert in everything that exists in this space or is possible in this space? I don't think so. I think he was quite an important milestone for a lot of people, and he's kind of gotten, he let 1,000 flowers bloom in his wake, and I think that's really, really important. I was very much emboldened and encouraged by his work, and him being very courageous at a time when people really didn't feel like pushing back against pronouns, because it feels like such a okay, whatever, I'll say whatever you want, but he was the fact that he was stalwart against that imposition, and that made that was the case heard around the world. I think that was really important for a lot of people. It definitely was for me. What he can offer now, I feel like he's kind of gone a little bit on the back burner because he also has a huge profile now. He has something to protect. He didn't really have much at the start of his career. He was saying things that no one was saying. Now the conversation has changed. It's moved. The new space that I think is important and is generative is kind of the post-liberal moment. Jordan Peterson is a liberal. He does not enter the space. He's actually gatekeeping the space. And a lot of people who are kind of in the IDW, Sam Harris types, they're also interested in not going past this point. I think what he has to offer is probably his old lectures. Go and watch, Maps of Meaning. It's wonderful, and there's a lot. Even his psychology lectures are great. It's super important content, super generative, especially if people haven't seen them yet. I don't know at this point if he's actually doing a lot of original work. I feel like he's kind of repurposing his greatest hits a little bit, and that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. He's produced more output than most intellectuals ever will. So That's kind of it for me.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Alex. And I want to ask you about the kind of descriptor of the meaning crisis. Do you think that's helpful? And what are some of the consequences and metrics that you think might actually make that a worthwhile way of describing the problems of today? I was thinking of things like rise in suicides, drug dependency, say sexual impotence, all sorts really. But do you think that's a helpful descriptor that the next Peterson have used? And do you think that's worth this space talking about?
Yes, I think it is a helpful descriptor. I think it's kind of, you know, downstream from the fact that, we really don't need each other anymore in a direct way. Like we don't need each other for food and shelter and things like that. And humans are a social species. We're supposed to be together. We're tied to each other in ways that we can't perceive. And now that we've been split from each other, that hole, that void is very hard to fill again, because it's almost kind of in economics there's this term revealed preference. People have the revealed preference that in a way they'd rather be alone. If they don't have to know their baker to get their bread, they're not going to. If they don't have to be social to solve the problem of the basic Maslow's pyramid type stuff, they're not going to. So I feel like a lot of that is tied to this almost natural drifting apart because technology has allowed it. So I think yes, the meaning crisis is one thing, but I feel like it's at heart for me. It seems to be kind of a disconnection crisis as well, and yeah, I mean, there are other layers to it, but I feel like that's kind of at the core of what a lot of people are complaining about. And the problem is, it's like, again, it's kind of a game theory problem. It's like, oh, I want to connect to people, but maybe they don't want to connect to you. It's very hard because I've lived in, the kind of the atomized big cities of the world, and you can have a friend to go out to lunch with every month, and you can have 10 friends like that, but it's you just kind of catch up with X and Y. They're not really part of your life. They're just kind of fleeting passengers through it, and there's kind of this constant loneliness about the existence. No one really wants to tie their days to you. It's too much commitment. It's too much involvement. It's too uncomfortable to deal with people every day, to, put up with their moods, to, navigate disagreements, to, you'd rather kind of drop a friend if they get too complicated rather than actually go through the slog of cementing your relationship with them. It's very, very hard. And you can see this in the fact that, most people have what is it, on average 0 friends or something. There's like a statistic. Okay, well, that's a pretty low average. So yeah, I don't know, to me that kind of is the heart of the matter. But yes, overall it's meaning. But where do you derive meaning from conviviality, from meaning something to another person?
Thanks, Alex. So, my kind of countryman, Keith Woods, quite a controversial figure.
Okay.
I'm not even sure if he's a Christian, but he goes into this interesting critique of transhumanism, which I want to kind of paraphrase here, if I may. So,
Mhm.
I think diverse Christian and non-Christian figures have each lamented this kind of banal worldview, which doesn't call us to the depths of that conviviality and things like that. A word I love, which Ellis uses too, which is great. And how that kind of outside world is seen to simplistically as made of just stuff, as it were. So Bernardo Castro gives out about that. And out of that stuff, then he says comes this kind of more complex life, but it's still stuff ultimately, with this kind of self-referential physicalist idea of emergence. And he hints at the different kinds of reductionism and how, from their perspective, the mind can be reduced to the brain and the brain reduced to chemistry that makes up the brain, and so on. And this trickles down to kind of pseudo religions like psychoanalysis, where the conscious mind can be reduced to the unconscious, and that can in turn be reduced to sexual desire. And then we see that with Marxism and economics, where you have this interplay of history and human agency, which can be reduced to the study of the material forces of reality and class relations. And then with some like other post-liberals, do you see this then as a basic trajectory and this kind of human plasticity? How do you hope people react once they see this or see through it and through this reductionist picture then from our like little subversive coalition, as it were?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. Yeah, but I mean, they're all kind of flavors of materialism, or that thing that like you said, it's everything's reducible to its component parts, and yeah, and this whole idea of emergence, which I use quite often, especially related to kind of social phenomena and kind of egregores and stuff. I think there is something to be said about emergence, but the idea that it explains the universe and every phenomenon that we see. It's like, oh, if you have enough brain cells, the brain will emerge. It's just emergence from, the basic components. And if you have enough atoms, brain cells will emerge. That's a very thin explanation. And I like that idea of, a lot of kind of the most malignant ideologies of the 20th century are essentially ideologies of emergence all the way down. Yes, in a way, I think the resistance that people see to this is the resistance that I had when I was a new atheist. If not emergence, then what? You kind of have to bring religion back into the picture, and I feel like a lot of people are resisting religion, especially old school religions, and then they invent all this new agey stuff that essentially uses the same ingredients, but just inserts emergence at a different level, where you still kind of have to have a leap of faith. Obviously, it's energies, man. Well, what type of energies? Like with the gamma radiation? What are you even talking about? So yeah, it's all leaps of faith, and I think that's kind of another thing that kind of drove me back to Christianity, and in the limping fashion that I've been driven back, is the idea that there is always a leap of faith. I saw through the many leaps of faith that I was making as a new atheist, and how toxic and destabilizing they were in my practical life, in the results. You shall know them by their fruits, and the fruits sucked. So that's a very easy way to see if your system is bad. If you have a bad life, your philosophy probably is shitty. Sorry to say, you should be doing something else. Yeah, I think that's kind of a instrumentalized way of viewing it, but at the same time, it's also pretty practical. So yeah, I think I like a lot of Keith Wood's kind of breakdown. I wasn't aware of this one, but it's a good one. How will people realize this, and what will they do if they realize this? Yeah, I think a lot of the red pills that have been offered by kind of the people on my show, and even by people like Keith Woods, there's this whole debate in a way now happening online and in these spaces between kind of elite theory and kind of the idea that in a way democracy, people knowing what's happening, and then they vote or they act, and then the regime changes on the basis of the wishes of the populace. I tend to go more towards the idea of elite theory. I feel like history kind of proves that the reality is shaped more by the actions and mindset of the elites, which trickles down in the sense that people aspire to elite ways of thinking, elite ways of it being, and almost by design do elites kind of shape what the results are in society. So I think that's if enough elites understand and internalize these messages, that's probably what's going to move things and what's going to change things. If people who have no influence learn about this, I think that's good. I think learning is good, but it's probably not going to be some form of, I don't know, popular revolt against the modern world. It might be a change where it just becomes more interesting to elites to be, for example, have more traditional lifestyles, for women to get out of the workforce, to have more children, to things like that. And that probably would trickle down to people in a more effective way than to say, okay, we're going to have an orthodox revolution from the ground up, grassroots Orthodox army and tear down everything and impose a new Caesar. Yeah, I don't know. It seems just more likely to me that it's going to be the other way around.
Thanks for that, Alex. So just sort of to conclude for today, I've got one or two questions. So I want to ask you, is there anything that we haven't mentioned, or building upon what we have mentioned, that you'd like to tell us about, or you still feel the passion to get involved with in the future?
Passion to get involved with in the future. Not really, to be honest. Today I got involved with the fight against surrogacy, which is yeah. So that's I don't know if that's going to be my new thing, but it's essentially based on my distaste for kind of transhumanism and also the idea that you can have like fungible female wombs just walking around being rented by I don't know different types of people trying to I know pay to get a baby. I just feel very uneasy about this, and I feel like this is another good point. I think Aaron McIntyre makes this point a lot. It's okay if you cannot rationally say why you feel uneasy about a thing. You could like for example, child pornography. I mean, maybe the children consent. Maybe they got a lot of money out of it. Maybe it boosts their self confidence to appear in pornography. You never you never know. Maybe they identify as pornographers. There's all sorts of things that you could say about that. It's okay to just say that you think child pornography should be outlawed and you think it is a grotesque thing, and you don't have to say why. Because a lot of things, we have pretty good instincts about good and bad, and we can get overtaken by people who maybe have better wording for their explanations on why you should override your instincts. If you have instincts, it's perfectly legitimate to just hang on to those. I know that's not the liberal way. I know that's not what science tells you. You should be rational never at every move. But sometimes you're more rational than by just even if you don't have the words.
And last question, just then where can viewers or listeners find out more about you and your work?
Sure. The main place where I am for now, until I get kicked off, is Twitter. My handle is at Kaschuta, which is just my last name. The Subversive Podcast is out everywhere on all podcast platforms. I also have a Substack and Patreon, which you could find if you type in my name. They're essentially the main advantage, the main selling proposition there is that you get everything very early. If you'd like to support the cause of subversive speech, please do donate. And that is pretty much what I do and where you can find things.
So thank you so much for your time today, Alex. It's been a pleasure to talk with you, and God bless you.
Cheers. Thank you so much, Mark.